Hi, this is Bobby Curnow, Chief Turtle Editor at IDW Publishing, and you are going to have a shell of a good time inside the pull bag.
You've just jumped inside the pull bag. Join TFG1 Mike and the rest of the comic reading crew here at the GCRN as they make their great escape into comics. From DC, Marvel, IDW, Boom Studios, Zenoscope, and more, we have everything you want to read right here. Transformers comics? Yeah, we cover that. He-Man? Yeah, sure. DC superheroes like Batman, Batgirl, Nightwing, and Batman Beyond? Yep, we have those too. How about TMNT from IDW and I Hate Fairyland from Image Comics? Yeah, we have all that here. Plus, so much more. It's all inside the pull bag here on the Geekcast Radio Network. So without any further ado, it's time to talk about the comics we are reading right now here inside the pull bag.
Say, Jarvis, is it that time?
The house party protocol, sir?
Correct.
Hello and welcome to the Pull Bag. This is the 400th episode. Holy crap. Can you guys out there in listener land believe it?
No.
And of course, no. Of course. That's not... Who's this guy? I don't know who this guy... I was expecting a deeper tonal no. I was expecting...
No.
That's not what I was expecting. That was...
Oh, no.
Not even that. I was expecting something. Please. No deep Dinobots. I am, of course, TFG1 Mike. And in this episode, we're going to be reflecting a bit on the last 8 years of the podcast, because as you've heard, joining me for the intro at least is Mr. Steve Megatron. Hello, sir.
Oh, yes. Hello.
Now, see, that's what I was expecting. And then after we do this little quick, short intro thing, the Comic Concierge himself, Mr. Dan Clark, will be joining me to discuss the comic book history of comics. And what this is it's from IDW Publishing. It came out May 13th of 2012. Wow, this thing is old. But then again, so am I. For the first time ever, the inspiring, infuriating, the utterly insane story of comics, graphic novels, and manga is presented in a comic book form. The award-winning action philosophers team of Fred Van Lent, I hope I'm saying his name correctly, and Ryan Dunleavy, or Dunlavy, again, I suck at name pronunciations, turn their irreverent but accurate eye to the stories of Jack Kirby, R. Crumb, Harvey Kurtzman, Alan Moore, Stan Lee, Will Eisner, Frederick Wortham, Roy Lichtenstein, Art Spiegelman, and many, many others. Actually, it was good old MovieRevolt Dan, Comic Revolt Dan, that told me about this, because they're doing a new one, The Comic Book History of Animation, and they're on the 4th issue of that so far. So that's what's going to be happening here inside the 400th episode of this podcast. Wow. Stuff sure has changed in 8 years, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah, totally.
I remember when we did the original introduction to this show, and I'm like, okay, this works. And we weren't sure. I'm pretty sure you and I weren't sure who was going to be the front runner, because you were really... like, You were the one that got me back into this. You were the one that got me back into comics full time, because you were like, oh my god, Batman 13, New 52, oh my god, the Joker, oh my god. And I'm like, okay, I'll check it out. And you weren't wrong. But it's one of those things where when you start a new show, you never know who's going to be more excited to take the reins. And of course, normally, because I have no life, I usually have more time than you do. I just basically took it and ran with it, and here we are 8 years later.
I know, it's crazy. When I spawned that idea in Geekcast Radio, I had no idea that you were going to go this far with it. Not to mention that, my interest in all things DC died like within years of it. Other than like the animated series stuff that the continues line, that's about my only like interest now, outside of the Beyond and some of that. But I'm pretty much an IDW guy now.
Yeah,
I mean, they have a multitude of other topics. Like they have Trek, they have Transformers, they have Beast Wars, they have Ninja Turtles. So I mean, they have a lot that resonate with me anyway.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And for me, as I've said in this episode and other episodes, as I say in every Origins episode, like this podcast, folks, I expected us to do a lot more After Darks, and After Darks were what we did for like actual conversations. I just looked through the entire history of this podcast the other day, and up until I think, was it episode 384? Yeah, 384 was you and I did a redo of our original Origins episode from episode 3 of the podcast, and that was the last Origins episode we had done until I have 2 new ones coming. But in 8 years, out of over 400 or whatever episodes, we've only done 31 Origins. So I've done 31 interviews to the point of 384. I have 2 more coming up. Episode 401 and 402 are going to be 2 new ones. So now we'll be up to 33. And, so I just like the interview thing that I set up with the 25 questions, with just asking people about comics and how they get into them or out of them. And it's not that I don't want to review comics anymore. I do. I still love reading comics. I still love talking about comics, but it's a lot of work, especially the way that I do it, because I like waiting for the trade. I don't like this single issue initial reaction stuff because I want the whole story all at once. But I get it. It is what it is, and that's generally what most people do. But, it's just crazy to me. Like, the fact that this is it's sort of related to this show, because there were plenty of He-Man comics from DC. Powers of Grayskull series, Optimus Soul and I started that 10 years ago this October. Or last October. Yeah, 2011 was when we started it. And I'm like, oh my God, it's a decade old. Holy crap. And we got 2 years until this show is a decade old. But yes, 400th episode. Can't wait to bring you guys so much more. I've got some special plans for episode 404 and episode 411. And we're kind of doing everything at this point. We're doing single issues, we're doing trades, we're doing just whatever we possibly can to give you guys comic reviews. Hopefully you've been listening since the beginning. If you haven't been listening since the beginning and you're brand new, welcome to the show. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to my neuroses, I guess you could say. 8 years, 400 episodes. I guess I have a penchant for intelligent conversation.
If that considers you talking to yourself a lot of the time, then yes.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So join us in this 400th episode as the Comic Concierge Dan Clark and I talk about the comic book history of comics. Coming up next here inside the Pull Bag.
Because the world needs another movie podcast.
The Geekcast Radio Network presents for your listening pleasure the Cinema Geek.
Hosted by Amanda, Kevin, Matt, and Dan.
Each week we dive headfirst in the landscape of movies as we discuss movie news, play movie games,
go in-depth on reviews,
and even have a top 10 countdown or two.
Also, don't miss our director retrospective series where we review noted directors' movies film by film. Bottom line is, if you love movies and love podcasts, you need to experience the Cinema Geeks.
You can find us on iTunes, Blog Talk Radio, or GeekCastRadio.com.
DeCian, the superhero webcomic. DeCian's got superhero antics and sexy girls. For action, comedy, mayhem, and more, read it now at DeCian.com. DASIEN.com.
You know, folks, it's so weird to toss to myself and then come back from myself. Yes, that's right. We are celebrating 8 years of the Pull Bag here inside the Pull Bag, only on the Geekcast Radio Network. And joining me for the rest of episode 400 is the Comic Concierge himself, Mr. Dan Clark. Hello, sir.
Hey, how are you?
I don't know. I honestly don't know.
Yeah.
It's like that meme I shared a little while ago. It's like 2021 is the same as 2020, except we have toilet paper this time around.
Hey, I think it's a minor improvement. Yeah, I guess that's fine.
So we're here, and this is, like I said, 400 episodes of the Pull Bag, and I didn't know what the fuck I was going to do with this episode. I was going to do number ones, because we did number ones way back in episode 100. I was going to do what we're actually going to be covering. I was going to do probably several other things that were probably bad ideas. I don't know. I could not decide on what the hell to do for episode 400. And you, in one of your more recent comic recommend blogs that you've been doing on geekcastradio.com, had said something about the comic book history of animation number 4. And I'm like, ooh, what's that? So I look into it, and I'm like, oh, it's IDW. I love IDW. And it's, I'm probably going to butcher his name, but Fred Van Lent and, or Lenti, and Ryan Dunleavy. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. And I looked into what else they had. I'm like, ooh, the comic book history of comic books. 220 pages. Fits in almost 90 years of comics. How is almost? Granted, this was published back in 2012. So not exactly a full 90 years of comics, but man, this thing is immense.
Yeah, it is. It is extensive. Because I'm reading, obviously, like you mentioned, the history. I didn't read this one beforehand. I got into the one they're doing currently. That's being released in monthly series, the animation one, and I've been really fascinated with that. And that's been chock full of information and really this great docu-comic about kind of that history. And so I kind of thought I knew what I was coming into, but I feel like this is even more packed. It's a different experience, obviously, because I'm reading that in like installments, and this is one go. And I was like, oh wow, over 200 pages, and each page is like, it is chock full of information, and they're not skipping on anything. Like this is a comic that is going to make you read. Like this is not something that you can kind of sit down and skim through. I mean, you can skim through it because there's a lot of cool things just to pick out, but like you definitely get your money's worth because there's a lot of information here, but it's not overloaded. So you feel like you're just like, just a random assortment of facts. Like it's done in an effective and and there's a lot of craftsmanship into this, in the execution of getting this entire history told in one, complete piece.
Exactly. It's kind of like, and I hope to God the creators do not take this the wrong way. And I have not watched all of these episodes yet. I want to, but I haven't yet. It's kind of like the history of swear words with Nicolas Cage on Netflix, but for comics. Because it's one book. Okay, it probably came out in, let's say, 4 or 5, 6 issues way back when in 2012. I am all about trades, folks. I love waiting for the trade, and obviously I didn't even know about this stuff until you brought, like you said, the comic book history of animation up, which is what they're currently doing. So I went back, and you were like, oh, they also have the comic book history of comics. I'm like, ooh, that would make a good 400th episode topic. 220 pages. How could we talk about this in less than 5 hours? Not that we're going to be here for 5 hours, folks. That is not my intention here. But it was one of those things where I'm looking at this trade, and I'm like, oh my God. And it is so cool. And normally I am one of these people. I am one person normally that black and white. I need color in my comics. However, this, I have to say, was done really, really well, and it is very, very fun in black and white. And the only color page is the very, very last, like basically the back of the book, essentially, is the only color page within the pages.
Yeah, when I first started reading it too, I was wondering if the color was eventually going to come in. Not that I mind black and white, because when it starts off, like it's it's talking about the very early history of comics prior to the in the 1800s, even before that, like when it first started, and it was utilizing that type of storytelling and not a lot of panels. So when I first started reading this, and it's in black and white, and it starts off similar to the comic books it's talking about, because it's talking about before the 19th, in the 19th century, like 1800s. Getting into like where comics first were done, and and it was mimicking that type of style. Like there wasn't really any panel borders and things like that. And then it talked about when those were invented, and then you see them kind of using that within the comic itself as well. So it was mirroring kind of where it was in a time and place in history. So I was curious, like, oh, are they eventually going to add color to this too when that becomes more prominent as well? It never does, which is fine. But that was my first thought reading it, because I really liked how they used that, like to kind of be this meta commentary on how comics progress by keeping to what comics looked like at that time, and then getting into how the language evolved with some of the different creators throughout time. Yeah. I found that fascinating, because that's something it's really, I think, an effective way too, just to learn the language of comics and understanding like where they came from and why things were done the way they were. Because for us, it's like, oh, we know the 9-panel grid, that's typical design, but learning where that came from and why it is and how it wasn't the original design, but like how everything evolved was pretty fascinating.
Yeah, and where they're talking about how you want certain things to be in focus and then certain things to blow up and have a big moment. As soon as I read that part of it, I'm like, hey, that's what Comixology Guided View is for. That's, and what I love about this is that it's, first of all, reading the letter at the beginning from what's his name? God, what is his name? I'm looking right through it now. From Tom Spurgeon. Yeah, Tom Spurgeon. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. It's like I'm reading a novel in a comic book. And I understand it's an introduction and it is supposed to be in the written word, and that's obviously fine. But again, the way that Comixology Guided View works is they do these panel by panels, and I've never really read a letter like that before. In that way of doing it panel by panel kind of thing. And I love all the legalese in the beginning. Like, yeah,
that was pretty funny.
That was fun. It was funny. It was fun, but it's like, and at the end of it, it's like, any other things we've forgotten, contact the publisher. Obviously, that's what you would do anyway. But
when that first came up, I'm like, I was confused at first. I'm like, is this what they're doing? Like, because there's a lot of things here. There's like a lot of history they're covering in that legalese. I'm like, this is a weird way to approach it. But I'm like, oh no, this is them getting ahead of all the difficult stuff and trying to do it in a fun way. It reminds me of this one comic I read that it took the entire Apple terms agreement and used that as the comic. Like it just, it told the comic using just those words from that throughout it. And I thought that was going to be, I mean, I knew it wouldn't be all like that, but I thought it just had a similar style and how it's like taking, and which also ties into a lot of the history, because it does get into a lot of the core battles that have happened throughout comics, and there have been a lot of them, that people have talked about. But that's one thing I liked about this too. I've watched a lot of documentaries about comic history, and a lot of them tend to hit on the same main topics. Like they're always going to talk about the comic codes of authority, which is in here, but there's much more to that. I thought that was, even if you're someone who's, I think, read up on the history of comics or watched those types of documentaries, like they did the Secret History on like AMC or whatever, I think that Secret Origins or something like that.
Right.
This to me is much more detailed in the way it's approaching everything, because it covers a wider spectrum, and it does it in, I think, a more clever way.
Yeah, it does it in a more clever way, and it also basically takes you back to 1896. Like, I mean, I knew that comics were around for a long, like I said, 70, 80, 90 years at this point. But I did not realize, I remember as a kid reading comic strips in the newspapers and things like that, but I never associated the comic strips with comic books as the evolution of the strip. I in all my life, 41 years, I've never, strips were one thing, books were another thing. Yeah. They weren't just, one wasn't the evolution of the other kind of thing, because you always have newspaper strips and whatever else. And yeah, just seeing that is so fun. And I love how they set up and tell the story. And it's a fun thing. And the different art designs that they're I'm flipping through the beginning pages where they're imitation and everything else, and how it changes as they're telling the story. And you have more You have more words in here than most comic books do. Even if you broke this down into the 6 issues that this trade collects, like I'm a few pages. I'm up to the point where they're going to be, Abbott and Costello. Yeah. Up to that point, there's so many words. It's like, oh, really? Okay. And I like that for this specific, for what this topic is, for telling the story of what comics was and what it is and what it could potentially be. I like that. I think that's good. Would this, would all the written stuff in this really work in a regular comic? Most likely not, because not a lot of people really care too much about how much Batman monologues.
Yeah.
The Joker.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I think too, it helps that it feels necessary because there is a lot to get through, and
right.
in order to like say it in a complete way. And also like what I found intriguing too is the way I wasn't sure like how this was going to be structured. Obviously, it's like it kind of goes throughout the years, but like there's a scene where we jump to and like we see Kid Jack Kirby. And I'm like, oh, well, we're already getting into Jack Kirby because this, we went from like the early 1900s, 1920s to Jack Kirby, but really it was using, it was showing how that time frame helped inform and shape like what Jack Kirby would become, and instead of just getting into Jack Kirby, but using his like how he was influenced as the ability to kind of get into like the amazing science stories of that time. And just show the connection throughout. I thought that was a really great way of doing it because you were able to kind of kill 2 birds with one stone in that instance because you're showing how you're showing Kirby's life at the same time getting into a specific time and space for comic history as well. And I thought that's one thing it did really well was that like it was almost always telling multiple pieces of history almost at the same time. But
at the same time making them individual because I'm at the page where it's extra new media invented daily will make us obsolete because the newspapers are whatever because the newspaper men, we're screwed.
Yeah.
And then that's when it breaks into Jack's life and Jack's story, but the art is completely different than what we just had in the last few panels of the newspaper stuff. And I love that. I think that's great that they that Ryan put this different spotlight on the different eras of the comics to show the growth that the industry was having and the differences in the times that things were being made.
Yeah. And I think, like you mentioned, the art style being able to be like, there's a lot of muscles being flexed here. Being cartoonish, to being able to showcase, how art changed throughout to ape certain styles. Like it's an impressive feat to be able to be that versatile, and be able to kind of juggle all those different aspects of the story.
I think I don't know a lot about Jack Kirby. I have not seen a lot of his stuff. I know I need to. So please, everybody, don't stream at your iDevices or your smart speakers or whatever. I'm working on it. Yeah. But I think my favorite panel in his early days, besides that opening of him finding the comic on the storm drain. Though Jack's astounding speed would later make him a legend, it got him kicked out of the Educational Alliance. I love the effect of him getting kicked out of the building and the art. Oh, that's so fun. I mean, heaven forbid he get kicked out, but he got kicked out because I think he got kicked out because he was so good. Because he could,
It's funny because speaking of Jack Kirby, I just recently read for last year the Tom Sicoli did like a unofficial autobiography of him. Mm-hmm. So if you are looking into getting into Jack Kirby, that's a good book to do that because it's obviously not his work, but it gets into his life and it does touch upon.
Right.
He had a little bit of I wouldn't say anger streak, but he wasn't afraid to throw down. In a few instances, obviously, he was a soldier as well. But yeah, I wasn't sure how because obviously Jack Kirby is such a huge piece of the history of comics, and he is in this too, and I think he's represented pretty well. And all the kind of tribulations he had to go through, as we talked about, some of the legal cases, and dealing with a lot of that as well, and seeing like how much it also puts in perspective how much comics like it was relying on him, and how much he kind of drove the medium for such a long period of time, because this covers a lot of ground, and he's typically there in the background or pops back up because he kind of drove the industry probably more so than any creator for since then or before or since.
Yeah, I mean, when you're at the wheel of an industry that needs to be kicked off and basically needs a kick in the ass to get it going, he sure gave us a lot. He did a lot for the comics industry, and even though I'm not someone who really can do comics before, I want to say 2000, 2001. I know that's sad to say, but I've tried reading some of the old comics of other things like Batman and things like that, and while it's nice, it's just not... I don't know. I think modern times and modern artists have spoiled me a little more than the classic stuff, and I guess I just have to get over that. But what?
Yeah, it's. I know a lot of people when it comes to Kirby. Not to make this the Kirby podcast, but like I didn't like his stuff at first. But I think when you see his pencils, like because a lot of inkers like kind of really destroyed a lot of his detail. When you see his pencils, you just realize just the insane amount of detail he would put in things, and you see just the dynamism and like the Kirby style, which this talks about. The Kirby crackle gets into. And like why it was so special, and this is I think a book that can help that, because I, like you, for a long time couldn't. I still think some of those comics they're hard to read because the dialogue can be pretty hokey and like over telling you things you really don't need. It's just there's a lot of it. But what I liked about a book like this is kind of getting into the mindset of that time frame and understanding that progression and like why books were written the way they were, and even talking about like I didn't realize how much vaudeville had to do with comics and how much that impacted the industry, especially when it came to like just the rhythm and the pattern. But looking at it now makes complete sense. But I had no idea how much vaudeville influenced the comic book, like kind of the infancy of the comic when it first started.
Yeah, when they were doing the Who's on First skit, I'm like, I've loved that thing for years, and I'm like, hey, it really works in comics. The whole panel by panel thing, and
yeah,
I was like, oh, that is very cool, interesting way to bring about the history of what happened, and it's just such like I went into this with no expectations.
Yeah,
I honestly, until you brought it up, until I saw the current thing that they're doing, Comic Book History of Animation, I didn't even know this was like, I've been following IDW for a long time now, for as long as this podcast has been on the air. But that started in 2013. And in the middle of 2012, I was solely ensconced in DC stuff, and we didn't really launch this show until 2013. So I didn't even know they had come out with this back in 2012. So reading this for the first time was like, oh, it's like I'm reading an actual prose novel as well as a comic book. That, again, it goes to what shows you in this book with hand in hand of how the Toon feud happened and how various things with Schuster and Siegel and all that. And you got Joe Simon, and you got all these creators, all these names that somebody knows, some comic book fan knows at some point or another. And just coming into it cold, even if I wasn't doing this show for the last 8 years, I would still probably have known half of these names, because who didn't grow up with the Fleischer Superman cartoons? Who didn't know that Bob Kane was the co-creator of Batman? You know what I mean? That's what we say now, but sadly, Bill Finger got the finger for 70 of those 80 years or whatever it was. But all these names that are happening in this story, and all the story that it's being told is like, oh, I've heard of that guy. I've heard of that guy. Oh, that's how he made his mark in this. And this is a book that I would recommend to anybody who wants to know why we comic fans feel the way we do about comics. In the fact of, would you like to know why we are like the way we are, to the point of, this is why. Even though we weren't around at the beginning of the history of comics, we've only come in the last 40-something years of it, I still have a healthy respect for all of the old stuff. I may not, enjoy it as much as other people did who may have grown up, may have been born in the 40s and grew up in the 60s, or, you know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's all about perspective, and it's all about the perspective of when you came into contact with it. It's like me trying to tell someone about the previous Transformers universe. IDW just ended recently, and they have the new universe now. But like, that was 13 years of Transformers comics that were really friggin' good. And, if somebody gets it, they get it. If they don't, they don't, and that's fine. You still have to have some sort of healthy respect for it. Yeah, and I think this is also a good comic if you would maybe get someone who is not into comics per se, because it's talking about comic history, but a lot of it's related to U.S. and world history. Tie into things like wars, tying into things like, the Comics Code of Authority was happening around the same time as like the Red Scare and things like that. It's not directly related, but it was during like this kind of newfound Puritanism of the United States, and like how much that impacted everything. So because comics were a reflection of reality, and so this in a way, getting into that history, getting into the U.S. history as well. And then also things like, understanding copyright and how that's evolved and changed, like owner's rights, and how, we see all these movies and these superhero films and realizing that, a lot of the people who made those happen are, not getting much of anything for their creations, and realizing that that's been an ongoing battle for such a long time, and why that happened. And it is very informative. And I've read a lot of like history of comics. Like I've read, there's the comic book history of wrestling, the comic book history of baseball. And I think that what makes the good from the bad, from the mediocre, is being able to like find that balance of being informative, also being kind of clever with it, and making it enjoyable, not just this dump of information, because, that's there. But I think it's all about how you organize it and craft it. And I thought this was one of the best I've read, because it, like I said, just the little being in a comic itself, I thought it was able to kind of relate and do a lot of clever things, not just give us information, but kind of tell a story at the same time to make it fun and interesting. I think which is like, I think the key ultimately, because if this isn't exciting, and then it's like, oh, comics can't be exciting because if their history isn't. But yeah. So. Yeah. The book follows not only Jack Kirby, but it follows Joe Simon and all of that. It follows Siegel and Schuster. And it's so funny, as I'm reading through this, I'm like, oh, Simon and Schuster. Wait a minute. I don't think that's I don't remember off the top of my head. I think my other favorite thing from this is when they get to the point in the book where their new comic book publishers and the shops that service them sprung up like mushrooms across Manhattan. You see this giant map of Manhattan, and then you see a list of all the publishers, like Eisner and Iger, aka Universal Phoenix, Funnies Inc., Harry H. Hessler. You see, national periodical publications, which would obviously later become DC. Timely would become later Marvel. But all these other ones that, like, I didn't know that Wiz Comics and Captain Marvel were Farrah Fawcett. I'm sorry, bad joke. Fawcett Publishing Company, or Ace Magazines was Super Mystery 4 Favorites, or I love seeing that, because I love seeing, again, it's showing you the history. It's showing you, sadly, when some of these companies started and ended at the same time. And some are still going, like DC, like Marvel, like Archie kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I even really like the heavy metal section too, and like 96 AD, like getting into that piece, because heavy metal is something I don't know a lot about. So that history was intriguing, because it's not just the U.S. comics it did get into. It didn't talk a lot about manga per se, but and it even got into animation. Obviously, there's the other comic that's completely animation, but this dives into that because those are two worlds that are closely related, like we talked about with the Superman cartoons, but even earlier than that, and Disney and how it impacted comics. So it's a very inclusive, extensive look into the world. And I think you talk about some of your favorite pages. One of my favorite is the evolution of the superhero page, where it shows like a superhero from the golden age, the silver age, and the modern age, and like just how they've evolved. It's very true. Like it does sum up comics pretty well, and how superheroes have changed from where they have been and where they are. Obviously, very exaggerated, but I thought that was one of my favorite pages.
The one thing with the cartoon thing that I'll say is one of the panels that I screen capped was the argument against cartoon features had always been that they wouldn't be able to sustain audience interest, because the public wouldn't be able to identify with drawn characters the way they do with live actors. They couldn't feel real emotion for cartoon people and their dramatic struggles. Are you kidding me? Like, seriously, I have more emotion out of I can point to one thing that everybody cries about. I don't, not anymore. But, Megatron shot Optimus Prime, damn it. You know what I mean? Like, the fact that these people thought that cartoon characters wouldn't be, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
I don't know. It's just that's just a silly notion, and obviously they were proven wrong.
Yeah, obviously, like, at the time, it was something that was just considered, it was a kid cartoon that had some laughs, and that was pretty much it. It wasn't something people really put much respect in, which is, I think also comics as well, because comics wasn't necessarily a medium. At one time, it was extremely looked down upon, especially during like the Comics Code of Authority trials and things like that. And a lot of comic book creators, and Stan Lee would even famously say, like, he would say he was a writer, but he wouldn't talk about being a comic book writer because it wasn't something people respected for the longest time. I mean, not, I would say, relatively recently. More so now than ever. But maybe even potentially, I don't know, like when that change happened. If it was like the 80s, when you had things like The Watchmen getting a lot of huge respect as a piece of art, and same thing like with Neil Gaiman's work. But it was always considered that a kid's medium, and it hasn't been for a very long time. Just a kid's medium, but I think people tend to just still think it that way. Even now with all the movies, I feel like we still haven't seen that transition from. A lot of people will like the movies, but they're still not necessarily what it used to be. There's still somewhat of a stigma with comics. But
it's just one of those things where comics, cartoons, even video games. The big stink over video games and cartoons and movies and entertainment in the 80s of, oh my God, they're going to run out and enact this stuff. Like, look, I grew up as a kid in the 80s. I knew what was on my television screen was fiction. I knew that was make-believe. I knew that was some, as a 10-year-old in 1990, I'm not going to go out skateboarding in a purple mask and cape. Thank you very much. I mean, Halloween not permitting, but it's one of those things where it's like, you look at the Simpsons intro for the longest time. Bart always does that skateboard trick off the pole. I could, even if I wasn't born disabled, I probably could never have done that in real life. The way it's done in the opening of the Simpsons kind of thing. And it's like, do these people not enjoy, like, what did people enjoy before this? That's like, anytime anyone's like, oh my God, the cartoons are so violent. Oh my God.
Yeah. It just goes to show you, like, looking at this is, especially the the Trial of the Innocent book that had such a huge impact on comics is that there's always that boogeyman, always that thing that's going to be the reason that's going to destroy the kids, and then every kid generation is always the worst kid generation of before. They're more violent than ever, when obviously that's not the case, and it does make you think like how much. Like what would the comic book medium be like if that didn't happen? Because if it did forever change comics had to, like a lot of those horror books and things like that had to kind of go away and get into more of the, very polished and maybe that's where we talked about things being kid friendly, where that sparks from is. But did that eventually lead to then like the more modern age where we get the deconstruction of superheroes like with Watchmen or the Black Hammer universe or Astro City? So I don't know. It makes me wonder like how much outside influence there has been on the medium, and this kind of gets into that. And just to see like it definitely stilted their evolution for you got people, and then until basically the Silver Age where people were able to take superheroes into a new light with like once Flash when Flash came back and Fantastic Four, and suddenly it's the whole rebirth of the not DC rebirth, but just the rebirth of the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no. Yeah. DC Rebirth is only a few years old, and sadly they've already killed it. But like,
it's funny that since then, like this came out before that, and it's actually like,
yeah. But at the same time, when I read through this, I did not feel like it was dated. This book is specifically a history starting from the beginning and ending at the point of publication back in 2012. It was not,
Yeah, it doesn't get into like, because really, I mean, unfortunately, not much has changed in the world of comics all that much since 1986. Like that year kind of redefined. I mean, some small things have happened. I shouldn't say that. Like Image, like the indie boom, like it's different than it was, but tonally, like mainstream comics have kind of stayed that same course for the most part. So there really isn't that much change. I mean, obviously you had the like what happened with Image and like industry wise, business wise, things have adjusted, and with digital comics now. Again, I would be interested too. Like, I think if they were to do like another issue of this, and getting into like the YA boom that has happened with things like Raina Telgemeier and people like that who have kind of redefined comics again for a new age, and how Scholastic is like the biggest comic book industry publisher right now. And how like that's because that may be one piece this doesn't get into, that potentially if they were to do a sequel issue or something like that would be something to look into, because that is something that I think a lot of people don't realize. They keep thinking Marvel and DC are the biggest publishers, and they aren't anymore by far. Like the YA books are kind of where the majority of comic book sales are right now, and then like things like Kickstarter. So I think we are finally seeing from like the 8 years since 9 years since this has come out. Jeez. That there has been some change, not obviously massive change, but if they were to do another issue of this, I think that those were some pieces that it touch upon, but ultimately it doesn't get into a lot of like post 2000, which is fine because I think a lot of that stuff has already been covered ad nauseum anyways.
Yeah, I mean, just look at any. And I'm not calling them out specifically. I am calling them out specifically, but I'm not calling them out specifically as a bad thing. Look at any comicbookresources.com article in the last 10, 15, 20. Anytime any of the big two adult comic companies and I know DC has kid stuff. I know Marvel has kid stuff. But honestly, seriously, are you really going to get... How old's your oldest now?
He's 5.
He's 5. Are you going to give your 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old Batman #1 by Scott Snyder? I don't think. Not that young. Maybe 12 or 13. Maybe somewhere like that. Kind, But like,
I think that is a kind of a lot of the main Marvel DC books aren't really kid friendly. Speaking of IDW, most of like the kid friendly Marvel books are published through IDW now.
Marvel Action, yep.
Yeah. So those would be more geared. But then there are certain characters that always have caught on with a younger audience, like Kamala Khan, for example. But I think those speak speaking to kids today much more than a Batman is. That, and obviously like things like manga and stuff like that. But yeah, I wouldn't like. I read a lot of them, not a lot of the main Marvel and DC books. So what I give to a kid under the age of 12, for the most part. There's some exceptions, but yeah, they're definitely written to an older audience. Like I said, I really probably since for some time now. But sometimes they can get a little bit extreme with it. There's like Darwin Cook, who's probably my all-time favorite comic book artist, would talk about it as well too, like how much the comics have changed. Where I would give New Frontier to a kid, because that does touch upon some more adult themes, but like not in a way that's in your face.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier about Kickstarter and all that kind of stuff, and man, let me tell you, Kickstarter, that is allowing people to do things that they probably never would be able to do.
Yeah,
I mean, even though it's people like us that are helping that, like, just as of this recording, my buddy Ryan Drost, his so far single issue of his comic called Stealth Hammer, I just got the reward for it just before we started recording this, because he had it on Kickstarter, it got funded, and they were able to go ahead and, make this one issue of this comic book. And, 10 years ago, that probably wouldn't happen. 20 years ago, I know it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah.
Kind of thing. Yeah. And it's
the self-publishing has changed a great deal. I mean, it was a lot harder. Like, you look at we talked about 1986 and how that's talked about, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the black and white boom that happened at that time. Yeah. And it was possible, but it was it was a lot of luck. It was a lot of people being at the right spot at the right time, people passing things along. It took that explosion happened, and you had to put it. There was no guarantees. With Kickstarter, you get that money up front. When you're back in the 80s or before that, you kind of have to put everything you have into it and just hope that you can make your money back. And maybe you make your money back. Maybe you get lucky and you strike gold and your comic goes off huge. But it's a lot easier now to make things, which is good because it's breaking down doors and barriers.
Absolutely.
But that also just means that there's a lot out there. But ultimately, looking at this comic, if you are I think a comic book fan, I would highly recommend it. It's available if you have Comixology Unlimited. It's on there for free. The trades are out, and this is one thing, like one of those books I think I'd want to get the physical book, and I was looking into it because I could see myself just picking a page out and then just reading it, because it's one of the things we'll go back to. There's so much to it. I think one read, you can't soak it all in, but going back to it, and just picking out pieces, or if you're ever going to talk about a certain book, it's a good reference point. So it's it's a resource and a good story on top of that. So
absolutely. Meanwhile, in space, I'm just kind of flipping through this on Comixology, even just using the guided view as we're doing this, and I'm like, wow, this has got so much in it. And we get the story of Stanley Lieber and Stan Lee and all of that, and
yeah.
The sad thing is, oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I thought it handled that pretty fairly, because that. There's a lot of rivalries and conflicts in comics, and how do you approach it? And I thought it was very fair, and because a lot of people kind of lean one way or another, I thought it handled those pretty matter-of-factly, not try to make one person out to be the villain over the other one. I thought it was trying to kind of find the truth in that, which I appreciated it, because it's some people, you can tell when I've read other pieces of that history, other either stories or articles or comics, and often you're oh, this, you can tell that they have a certain allegiance to one creator or the next, where this one I thought was just trying to get to the truth and the reality of the situation. So
yeah, but reading through this, I'm thinking to myself, all these giants of industry are, for the most part, most of them are no longer with us. And I'm not saying they're going to live forever. Where they live forever is in the pages of the comics that they created and the characters that they created that other people now are able to tell stories with. And I think that is amazing. But just going back and hearing, just reading about all these names and reading about all these people, it's like, even though there were turmoil and tribulations and everything else during any of this history, what a wonderful time that would have been to be alive, to be someone who is getting a timely comic or just DC, Marvel, whatever you know what I mean, Image, Valiant, whatever. Like in that time of again, we talk about it this often on this show sometimes, where it's like, oh, I miss the spinner racks. I miss being able to go to, and it was so silly because they didn't really treat, well, like we were saying earlier, they didn't really treat them as books. I could go into a Walden Books in the Kingston Independence Mall in 1990 or 1994, grab a Spider-Man issue off a spinner rack in Walden Books of all places, and they're like, oh, you're buying a comic? I'm like, yeah. I was 10 or 14 or whatever it was at the time, but it's like, I just wonder what it would be like for those people that were that age at that time, that Kirby and Simon and Stan and everybody was putting stuff out to, the excitement that we get of, let's say, IDW's TMNT coming out every month, or Image Comics has Radiant Black, or Boom has Power Rangers, or whatever it is. Like the excitement that we get now for the books that we're reading now, I wonder what it was like then, and I wonder like what these companies are going to do in the future once we're all gone, and see what the next generation of readers would be like. I think my overall favorite, funniest panel in this book is the DC logo walking the Marvel logo like a dog.
And as a Marvel fan, I was extremely offended, but not really.
It's just a joke.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
I know.
but it's like so funny.
That's the thing too. Like those moments, I think, is what makes it intriguing, because there's a lot of humor in this, and cleverness, which is why, like I was saying, like they're like we're talking about on the information it's giving, but I never felt overloaded, because there was always the way it was brought to you was very clever, and why I really like the current one they're doing, the animated one. It has a similar type of vibe. Where they're talking about Dumbo, and they're showing Dumbo in the middle of Pearl Harbor, which I thought was just really funny, because that came out around the same time as Pearl Harbor. And I thought like that type of that one's colored though. So
right.
Anyways, that's irrelevant. But I just this is a really strong team, and I really like what they're doing with this. So like after doing animation, if hopefully if they do another one, whatever that may be, it doesn't go as long between issues, but yeah. So
this is again why I love waiting for the trade. Like the trade for the Comic Book History of Animation comes out, I think, May 26th. I can wait 2 months. I'm fine.
Yeah, I appreciate it coming out in monthly issues, because like it's so rare to get nonfiction comics in that type of format. Like they're very common graphic novel wise, but seeing it in a monthly format is so rare. And that's what I love about comics, is the variety and the diversity in the medium. And sometimes that can get it can get minimized because superheroes overtake it or what have you. So anytime I see a book like that, which I'm like, oh, this needs to be, more people need to know about it. That's what that big reason why I wanted to include it. And this is, I think, good opportunity for this too, because this is obviously not. I mean, you could probably find the individual issues, but there's a lot of other ways to keep this. Like I said, it's available digitally, or you can get the trade if it's still in print.
Yeah, I mean, it's just so cool and so interesting seeing this story played out in seeing the history of comics played out in a comic book, and seeing every aspect that they touch on, from Batman to Adam West to this to that, and how it just keeps going up and up and up and up and up. And
yeah. Because like we should mention, it does talk about like the media that comics influence, like you said, with Adam West and the movies and stuff like that too. So that's the one thing. Looking at this and seeing like Jack Kirby and the other creators, wondering like what they would think of seeing a world in which, you know, everyone's talking about WandaVision, everyone's talking about their movies are the biggest movies in the world, and there's the stuff that they created, like, you know, we talked, you know, comics, it's going from the stigma of like this is the thing killing our, you know, making our kids evil to $1 billion trillion franchises, and unfortunately they don't get to see that, you know. But some of them do, but it just, it makes you realize all the hard work and dedication it took to get to that point. Because, like, if I was Jack Kirby, you know, like I could see why he would want to give up and probably make better money doing something else, but he just kept going because there was something about the medium that he loved, and other creators as well. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a fun read. It's pretty much the best way. Like, we often say, and I said this 8 years ago when we started this podcast, I really don't want to have to go through the last, at that time, 70 years, 80 years. You know, we were just hitting 75 years of Batman was the next year in 2014. So, you know, we've hit 80 years now, but it's like when I started the pull bag, it was like, I don't want to have to read the last 80 years to figure out where this character is now. Give me a story where it begins at the beginning and where I don't have to look through issues 600 to 900 or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, and everyone always criticizes the whole, and I do too. I'm not including myself in this. Oh, they rebooted again just to get a #1, or they did this, or they did that, or whatever. Hey, companies got to do what they got to do to reinvent themselves. We may like it, we may not like it, but there were a lot. If I didn't come in at I don't know where I would be now if I hadn't come in at the time that I did with DC, because New 52 had pretty much was maybe 3 or 4 years, because they started that in 2011. No, yeah. New 52 was 2011. And when I got into it in 2013, I was like, oh, okay, cool. And then I always find, and I know the listeners are tired of me saying this, but I'm going to say it every time, I always find characters I like. It's never, for me, it is never like when we ask the question in the Origins episode, DC or Marvel. For me, the answer is always both, because it depends on the character, not the publisher.
Yeah.
I like Batman, I like Iron Man, I like Captain America, I like Nightwing. Like, I like Batgirl. I like, I don't want to say WandaVision, but, you know, like, and I don't want people to hear me say that. And no, he doesn't like, no, I'm trying to think of another female character on Marvel's side, and I really can't at the top of my, like, you know, now that we have this.
Miss Marvel, Phoenix.
Yep. There you go. Phoenix, Rogue. Jean Grey. Yeah, Rogue. There you go. You know, now that we have what is the Marvel Cinematic Universe and now the Marvel Television Universe with the Disney Plus stuff, it's like, ooh, this is so cool. Like, all right, well, I'm just, have you seen it? Have you seen the finale yet?
Yeah, all the shows, of the WandaVision.
Yeah. All right. Right now, folks, at this point in time of episode 400 of the Pullbag, there will be spoilers for WandaVision, so you have been warned.
Spoilers.
2 moments in that finale that I absolutely loved is when she got the full Scarlet Witch costume at the very end of it, and when the two visions were not necessarily battling, but when they got to a point where they could actually talk to each other.
Yeah.
And the one vision gave the other vision the thing, and just everything was kind of okay. Like, I loved the two of them absolutely talking it out and figuring it out and coming to a conclusion the way Vision would. And I still think of that guy as Jarvis. I always will. Yeah. And like I said, if you're, I know they've had a lot of
documentaries about comics, about the history of comics. And I mean, even Disney Plus is doing some recently. And those have been good, but I think this is, to me, a more impressive amount of information and covers a wider spectrum. So if you enjoyed those and you wanted something deeper, because like a lot of those cover the same stories over and over again, they hit the same beats, where this doesn't, and it hits some of those like we talked about, but I think it gives more of a full story, and
it gives more of a full story because it gives more of a full story and perspective, because the people that are trying to tell the story, both in the writing and the art, are essentially biographers at this point. Yeah. They are people who are looking at it from the outside. It's not, someone from Stan Lee's family or someone from Jack Kirby's grandson, or it's not people attached to the people that the story is being told about.
Yeah.
And again, I think that puts it in a light where, this is a story about the history of comics, about all of the history of comics and all of its creators that brought us to where, they, again, paved the way to where we are today. If this would be a very vastly different world if Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Joe Simon, Siegel and Schuster, Kane and Finger, if none of them did what they did, I don't know where comics would be today. I can't even imagine a world being different than what it is with these creators doing what they did.
Yeah, for sure. And seeing the obstacles they had to overcome with it, and how strenuous that was, it wasn't easy. And I mean, and how a lot of them had to fight for their rights, and then a lot didn't get them until not too long ago, maybe even longer, after they passed. And just how cutthroat the industry has been, and it's you could understand why people who the creators of Superman may hate comics, because it completely took what they created and never really gave them the acknowledgement that they deserved, and that was kind of the common. Creator rights were non-existent. So it makes you appreciate it and understand that I know people, there's been a lot of, for example, Watchmen, and people have some issues when there's other Watchmen comic book series that come out, because Alan Moore's been pretty open about not wanting anything additionally Watchmen to be related, and how he kind of got screwed with the rights, because he thought once they stopped making Watchmen, he'll be able to get all the rights back, but they just haven't stopped doing anything with it. So it's and anyways, just seeing the creative spirit that went into it compared to the history of it in one piece of a comic, I think it really puts all that in perspective, and the rewards as well as kind of the darker side of the industry, because ultimately it is business, and with business, unfortunately, just because you're right doesn't mean that you'll win, and most often the case is that's the case. That's what happens when it comes to comics.
Yep.
So you got anything else before we end?
Oh, I mean, it's a fun book. Everybody should read it. I think it's, it may be a long read and trade, but like you said, you can get the single issues on Comixology. I do not know if IDW still has this in print. I'm sure you could find the trade in a comic shop or something. But it's just so fun and so interesting.
Yeah. It's like I said, it's something you will definitely get your money's worth, and I could see you going back to time and time again. It's still available on Amazon, so you can still buy it physically if you would like to do that. So
awesome. Oh boy, 8 years. Where the hell do we go from here? Well, folks, I can tell you, but you jumped on a little later than when we started. But what were your initial thoughts when I started this show way back when?
Well, that was at a time when when it comes to comics, I've been on and off.
Right.
I'm not someone who was comics as a kid and read them every year. That wasn't really a time that I was that into comics, but it in a way helped me get back into it. Just hearing you guys talk about I know, obviously, I think remember Batman was one of the key things that really got you into it. So I felt like it was a big part of Geekcast Radio that we didn't really cover was comic books, and I think it kind of ignited that fire that I had, where I was really into comics until about 2010, 2011, when the comic book shop I went to closed down. Right. And I moved, so it was like, I kind of went away from it, but then getting into it, and then with the birth of digital comics, being able to get access to things a lot easier, and libraries and things like that. So it helped ignite that to the fact of, I just went to the library today and picked up like 30 comic books, compared to like before where I would not read much of anything. So I think a big reason because of that was you guys covering the industry and getting into different stories and putting out episode upon episode. So it's been a joy to be a part of and listen to.
Absolutely. I did not think we would hit 400. I honestly was not. It's 8 years of content, and it is, believe. Oh, go ahead.
So are you rebooting and going back to?
Oh no! Are you kidding me?
Pullback Unlimited or something like that.
No. I mean, we could name it that, but no.
Fresh new number one ish episode with 18,000 variant covers and stuff like that.
So, I wish. If I could only get Steve to do 18,000 pieces of art for this show. I mean, I know I'm a slave for when it comes to him doing art for this, but and I appreciate every banner he's made, every banner TV's Mr. Neil has made for the show, and the fact that the show wouldn't be this show without Michael Powers, because he was the one that gave me the name for it. Originally, it was going to be called The Pull List, and I just don't think that really works. So, but the Pull Bag, yes, we are continuing on, and it's funny. I've actually been trying to get him on a show with me for years, and now that I have the Origins format the way it is, I think I should be able to get him on, considering upcoming is one of his cohorts on an Origins episode. Michael David Sims over at earth-2.net, so Earth, just a dash, the number 2.net. He has been doing podcasting for almost 20 years now. He's been doing it for 16 years. And back in 2007, 2008, when I got into listening and then obviously producing, it was like, oh, I need to emulate this, and then find my own way from there. And his main show, Earth2.net, the show, has over 1,000 podcast episodes since it launched October 25th, 2005. I'm not saying the Pullback's going to get to 1,000 episodes. I'll probably die before then, sadly. But I'm 600 away, Mike. I'm going to catch up to you. I don't know. I honestly don't know. What I do know is where this show is going for the majority of 2021. Episode 401 and 402 will be 2 Origins episodes. One will be Desmond Reddick of Dread Media. Des is that aforementioned person that is friends with Mike Sims, and Mike actually publishes Des's podcast, Dread Media. It's a horror podcast. It's actually really, really good, even though I'm not a horror person. It's a really interesting look at horror, and they, Des loves it and everything else. After that, we got another Origins with Mikey from Moonbase 2. So we got that, and then I have to find a new normal for this podcast, like everybody else has to find a new normal for the world we live in now. A mix between monthly books and trades, because Steve Megatron wants to review Beast Wars individually, and I'm like, fine, sure, great, but like, I still want to wait for the trade. I'm also doing Radiant Black individually. Autobotly April will return this year for Transformers comics, which we've got a bunch of trades and stuff from the new universe for that. May will be a partial Batman month. I do have 2 special episodes coming, and I don't know how I'm going to do them. I almost wish we would have saved this for this one episode, but episode 404 is basically comics not found. So 404 error code, yada, yada, yada. My thought on this is we start out talking comics, and then we talk about anything else other than comics, and then somehow tie it back into comic books at the end of the show. I don't know how that's going to work. No clue. And then episode 411, episode 411 is, the information of comics. And I almost think we should have waited for that for this one. But this is more the history. I figure episode 411, episode 411, we could do like you were talking about, you go to the library, you use digital, you also go to your local comic shop kind of thing as well. So maybe we can put together some sort of digital pamphlet or something of everybody has a different approach to comics, but I feel that anyone can approach it any way, and here are the best ways to do so kind of thing. I don't know.
Nice. Yeah, a lot planned. That's really cool.
Yeah. Oh yeah, you know me, planning year ahead. So yes, where can the people find you online, sir?
You can find me on Twitter at Comics. It's the best place to find me. Also, Comic Concierge on Instagram, and most of my stuff is on Geekcast Radio.
Absolutely. You want to talk about your group on Facebook?
Oh yes, I did recently start a Facebook group. So I've been a part of some Facebook groups, and they're awful. It's often like just a lot of horrible people, and or just people just trying to sell comics, and I'm like,
right?
Are there groups for people that like to read comics? So I created a group about for comic group for people who like to read comics. And if you want to join that, you can just search for it on Facebook, and I'll add you. Just trying to find a good general hive to talk about and discuss comics in a way that's not about speculation or just people complaining about stupid stuff. And it's hard to do on Twitter because Twitter things can come and go. I know they're going to be creating communities, but I felt like Facebook can be a good spot for that if you can cultivate a community. And I've been trying to join pieces, and most of them eventually devolve. So I'm like, you know what, I'll try my own. So if you want to check that out, you can get it on Facebook.
Yeah, I'll put the link in the post so people can go directly to it. I am at TFG and Mike on Twitter. You can follow all the other stuff that you hear in the outro after this. Like I said, coming up next time is my discussion with Desmond Reddick, a person that I'm quite literally 8 hours away from. He's up there in Canada. And it was a fun conversation getting his origins of comic reading, and I love doing those episodes. And it's funny because I never actually added up how many origins I've done in the last 8 years, and I think Des is number either 31 or 32 or 33, I forget. But basically, out of 400 episodes, we've had under 50 episodes that are origins. And I like doing those because I think it brings up more conversation, even though it's just me and one other person. We can still have a good conversation about comics because everybody's approach to it has been different. And no one person has the same comic origin than somebody else does. So yes, make your great escape into comics, and we will catch you next time here inside the Pull Bag.
Oh yes, but think of the fun.
You've just heard the latest episode of The Pull Bag, the GCRN's first comic review and discussion podcast. There are several ways to get in touch with us and leave feedback for the show. You can visit the website, geekcastradio.com, where you can comment on the episode and all of our different podcasts. You can rate and leave a review for the show on iTunes. Be sure to leave us feedback. Become a fan of us on Facebook, facebook.com/thepullbag. Send us an email, feedback at geekcastradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thepullbag and at geekcastradio. So until next time, make your great escape into comics and unleash the geek in you.
Come here. I'm the best there is at what I do, and what I do can't be imitated, copied, cloned, or used without the express written permission of the Superhero Squad and Marvel Entertainment, LLC. Batteries not included. All rights reserved. Terms, conditions, and restrictions apply. We clear, bub.
Yes, sir.